What pleased me enormously in your letter was the bit about Till We Have Faces, for I think it far and away my best book, but it has, with the critics and the public, been my one great failure, an absolute flop. No one seems to have the slightest idea what I'm getting at in it.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 34, Till We Have Faces Primer. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. This season, we've read chapter by chapter through Perelandra. We've explored Jack's bookshelf. We spent a month in Narnia. And now in July, we actually enter the last month of Season 8. We had originally intended to have 2 more months, an After Hours month and a Charles Williams month, but we kind of ran out of time. We had Matt's wedding and honeymoon at the beginning of the season, so we didn't start recording this season very early. And it took us 25 episodes to get through Perelandra, and we're recording this episode a few weeks in advance, but when this episode drops, the next day my son is going to be born, which means that I am not going to have a whole lot of spare time for a little while. So,
or sleep.
All that, yeah. Actually, newborns aren't too bad, but I'll be managing the other 2 gremlins, so I will be pretty busy. Seriously, they woke up before 6 a.m., both of them this morning.
Oh, no.
But this season, we now just have 2 episodes left. We'll have a season finale as usual, but today we're going to actually address something that Matt suggested during a recent Common Room session. And if you haven't seen these, we record them on YouTube once a month. It's sort of an opportunity for us to chat about adjacent things, what's going on in our lives, so we don't spend too much time chatting about it on episodes when we're meant to be talking about a text. Anyway, on the Common Room, the subject of Till We Have Faces came up, as it often does, and Matt suggested that we put together the definitive introduction, the definitive primer for someone who is about to read Till We Have Faces. And so that's why in today's episodes, we opened with Lewis's letter to Audrey Sutherland, because he is describing many people's experience of Till We Have Faces. They have no idea what he's getting at, and among some people, it is his best book. Some people say that quite regularly, and other people just don't get it. They think it's an absolute flop. So we might get into our own opinions on that subject towards the end, but the bulk of this episode is meant to be our suggestions for someone who is about to read Till We Have Faces for the first time. But before we get any further, gentlemen, welcome to the penultimate episode of Season 8.
Oh, that's such a lovely word. Do you know what penultimate means, Matt?
Yeah. Andrew, you've got really mean recently. Everyone used to say I was the mean one to Matt. Now it's become you.
Actually, I came across this word, years ago, but I was
Andrew,
talking about
if you need confession, I know a priest.
Okay. Ego me absolvo.
Doesn't work like that, mate.
Maybe not in your church.
I love it.
Yeah, the next to the last episode. Yeah.
In all seriousness, no, I'm very excited for this episode because I think we'll have, my hope is, unless David's overpowers my desire here, is we'll have a blend of the Batesian rigidity, which will be great structure of like just bullet points. But I also kind of want to wear the hat for listeners that are curious as you're here in the early stage of this episode, of really pressing Andrew to just help the why, the beauty, the diving into that side of it as well. So I almost like take on the role, which is not taking it on. I'm in the seat of this role of just not understanding this book myself and not understanding the why behind it, the beauty behind it, why it had to be put this way. And it's not me trying to like actually convince Andrew that he's wrong. It's really genuinely, I want him to have a chance to like speak to what I know that I probably represent to great masses of individuals who read this book and just are like, huh?
Well, and not just you. I mean, I remember clearly my first reading of it. I was given a copy of the first edition by Linford from Over the Rhine. And I remember reading it on a flight from LA back to Nashville and just not getting it. And it's what I call the Till We Have Faces whiplash. Like the book goes right over my head and I have no idea. And so I had exactly the same experience. And it troubled me until, several years later, probably 10 years later.
And my hope is to get that, like for you, Andrew, with you, like my hope is to get, what was that aha moment? Because you hear people say you got to reread it again.
Sure.
But like, All right. I get that.
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm laying out. And the fun thing is I'm writing my dissertation, which is the critical book. I'm finally writing C.S. Lewis and the Myth of Love with Diana Glyer. So I really hope I think that I do have what Lewis says. I think I do have the slightest idea of what he was getting at. And so, so for me, it's the same experience.
And I'm going to say one other thing. I want us to tease out the aha moment. What is he getting at? But then I do want us to have a little bit of a discussion of like, was this a beautiful way to do it? Like also convince me that this was like a great way, even after we understand what he's getting at, like from the four loves and all of that stuff. Like, did he do a good job of actually doing it? I actually do want to have that conversation a little bit.
Sure, absolutely.
Right. We'll get to details in a moment, but any quick life updates you guys want to share?
Oh, my life is all work right now.
My life is all interviews right now. I'm June 15th, Holy Trinity Sunday is my last day at Church of the Messiah. And my rectors asked me to preach the last 2 Sundays. So this coming Sunday's Pentecost, and the following Sunday is Trinity. And I'm going to talk this week about the absence of God that Lewis talks about in the Four Loves, how God is confusing, how the Holy Trinity doesn't make sense. But if it did make sense, that would be idolatry. So and next week, I'll talk about the immanence, the closeness of God. So what to do when God feels far away and how to understand how close he is. So wonderful to get to do a little 2-part series. First time I've ever preached that. But it's a sad time for me and Kristen and an uncertain time. We have 2 job offers, a 3rd interview that we haven't heard back from yet. We don't know where we're going to live in the next couple of months. There's a lot of uncertainty, and that's been very hard. So we're trying to keep close. And as I said, I'm working on my dissertation. I'm also working on another project that I can't say much about now, but we'll say more about soon. So yeah, that's pretty much where things are for me.
For your Trinity Sunday sermon, I expect you to quote Donnell and Connell from Lutheran Satire.
Oh, Patrick.
Oh, Patrick. That's modalism, Patrick.
I want to stab you in the face, Patrick. Actually, I was talking about the Trinity with a parishioner, and she said, oh, I heard a great analogy for it. It's like a man can be a father and a son and a husband. And I said, that's modalism. And then I played her the video, and so she laughed.
There will be a link in the show notes to that video. It is amazing. Seriously. The quality of that, Lutheran Satire is generally pretty good, but that to me is still their best video to date.
Well, and if folks struggle with the Trinity, kind of the bottom line of my next sermon is the Athanasian Creed says that all 3 persons of the Holy Trinity are incomprehensible, and if we had made God up, we never would have made up the Trinity. We would never have made up something beyond our understanding. And to me, that's a great comfort that I don't understand, because it shows that there's a mind bigger than my mind at work. Lewis says the problem with arguing with God, with using reason against God, is he's the one who made up reason. So anyway, that's a little bit of my daily life right now.
Well, as for myself, I am now on day 96 of my Duolingo streak in Latin. Thank you very much. I'm really proud of that.
Vale.
Yeah, vale indeed. I've also been doing lots of half pint interviews, so you can expect these to continue even after we finish this season for a little while. I've interviewed the host of the Good Stories podcast, which was so much fun, as well as Dr. Jason Baxter, who is just continuing to pump out amazing stuff. I'm actually also just back from my Chicago trip. I have to go there about once a quarter. And so I am now pretty much on the countdown for the baby. Number 3, my mum is going to be here in like 3 weeks. And then baby is going to be turning up the week after that.
Yay,
so,
little Matthew Andrew.
So if you wouldn't mind praying for my wife, because she's going to have a C-section. If you want to try out a little bit of Charles William substitution, taking on her fears and worries, that would also be very much appreciated.
Absolutely.
But what are you guys drinking?
Actually, and David, let Marie know, as Kristen and I are full of anxiousness and worry, even though that's not very spiritual to say. we'll try to take hers on. And we're fasting and praying today. And so let her know that we will intentionally try to carry some of that. So remind her that at least that little satchel is being carried by us. Today, I'm drinking out of my Beijing mug, my same old Texas Taste of San Antonio coffee from HEB.
I am obviously showing off the Pints with Jack. Deep laser etched, stunningly beautiful. And I am drinking that ESB from Athletic Brewing. And it's growing on me, I would say.
Oh, I'm pleased.
Yeah.
I'm pleased.
Okay, good.
I'm also doing an Athletic Brewing. I'm doing their Downwinder, which is very nice. There's a little hint of lime in it. It's rather delicious.
They've done a great job, I have to say, of like building a brand. I never even heard of Athletic Brewing pre-non-alcoholic. A number of big brand beers are making non-alcoholic versions of theirs, yet we all just talk of Athletic Brewing.
Well, let's toast to Athletic Brewing then. Good job. Cheers.
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 Okay, so opening question till we have faces. What are your opening thoughts about how people should approach this work? Matt, do you want to go first?
Avoid it. No, honestly, your thoughts should be, in my opinion, now, first of all, if this is your very first entry into C.S. Lewis, and for some reason it turns you off, don't make it your first entry into C.S. Lewis personally, but don't let it sway you. If you struggle, don't beat yourself up. You are not alone. If you are intrigued, keep pressing through multiple reads, because allegedly, according to others, that it'll start to open up. Now, it might be 2 reads, 3 reads, 4 reads, or 5 reads if you're me, or never, but hopefully it does.
Well, I actually polled Slack users regarding this question. Sarah McHale, she said, read it once for the story and twice to start to understand. And JK echoed saying, be prepared to read it twice. That's practical advice, but it also tells you what you're in for. And the rest of his response went like this. Probably the most important fact that would have helped me would be to know that Lewis considered paganism pre-Christian. And he considered paganism closer to Christianity and thus closer to truth than modern secularism. And he says that might soften the blow for people familiar with Lewis's typical Christian or Christian allegorical setting. I would share some common responses to the book, namely that people feel the whiplash, and many people feel like, I know that meant something, but I'm not sure what feeling. Even Lewis scholars have that experience, and not uncommonly. If, as you're reading along, you start to get the feeling that the novel is taking place on several different levels simultaneously, yes, it is. Strap in and enjoy the ride. And he said, finally, you might just be reading the best piece of literature that's ever been written, and no, my name is not Andrew Lazo.
Yeah, well, and let me suggest that it's not, I don't think what I have is a bias. I don't think I'm just...
Sorry, just clear my throat. Carry on.
Yes. I said, I don't think what I have is a bias. And partly because I've been reading and rereading this book for 19 years. I mean, regularly, reading it, often several times a year, and reading it word for word, line for line, and teaching it. And I have exactly the same reaction to everybody else the first time reading it. In terms of my opening thought about this work, I think that there's 2 quick thoughts. Lewis says that theology is difficult because, like physics, it's trying to do the same sort of thing. Theology should be hard. It's trying to explore the nature of the universe. If this book is, as many claim, Lewis's culminative book, if this is far and away his best book, it should, like both of you have already mentioned, it should work on a number of levels, and there should be a complexity to it that isn't there in some of Lewis's quote-unquote easier works. The second thing I'd say is that we didn't really understand the planetary nature of Narnia until 50 years after it was published. And in a similar way, I believe that the work that I have been doing for 20 years shows some of the complexity and some of the whys behind it. We'll get into that later in the podcast. I think that when Lewis says nobody has the slightest idea what I was about, I think that has been true for most of the time. And that's why I'm so excited about it, is because I really think that I figured out what Lewis was really trying to do. By that statement, it means that he was trying to do something and everybody missed it, right? He's getting at something and everybody missed it. And that's what it should be like until we figure out what he was getting at. So I hope that I can help folks do that.
Well, and Andrew, you made me think of the perceived difficulty of the novel. It's not accidental, but can be understood sort of like a deliberate artistic choice.
It's intentionally complex.
Yes. But honestly, because the spiritual journey and the psychological pilgrimage, which is at the center of the character, is going to be complex by definition. So the book, which is kind of immersing you in that, is going to be complex.
Sure.
We know that obviously he's a master communicator, and we're dealing with, and we also struggled with the four. In fairness, an argument for Till We Have Faces. If it's like as you've talked about, very related to Four Loves, we struggle with Four Loves, which is more my style. Just tell me straight up, directly.
Sure.
And I still barely understood that. And so what he's trying to do here is obviously going to be hidden and difficult to tease out.
He's probing the nature of love. He's probing the nature of the relationship with God. He's probing the nature of the human soul. He's probing the dishonesty that lies at the heart of all of us, that God needs to cure, from which God needs to cure us. And so the things that he's trying to do are all fairly complex, and he's trying to do it within 300 pages in the form of a novel. So God help him, and I'll do what I can.
I put down a number of bullet points, and the ones that we haven't mentioned thus far, I would say for someone approaching this, try and have as few preconceptions as possible. Don't think that it's going to be like the Ransom trilogy or like Narnia. I generally say that's true for all of Lewis's books. If you are reading a new one, don't just simply assume it's going to be like the other ones. He was very flexible. He wrote in the genre, that he was writing in. So don't just expect it to be a copy and paste of what he said before, although many of the similar ideas will be reappearing.
And let me just say too, don't expect it to be like them, but it is on a really complex level. And this is also Lewis's last and most mature novel. And so that's part of why, I totally agree.
And the last thing I would say, and this is kind of counterintuitive given everything else that we're going to say, don't spend all of your time trying to decipher it. Just simply enjoy the writing, enter the story. Because that is how Lewis is actually trying to communicate to you. And I would say this is really good advice for all of the sort of Inklings and Inklings adjacent authors. I only really started to get George MacDonald when I just tried to enjoy the story, just immerse myself in it, and then seeing what was happening, rather than trying to, well, what does this symbolize? What does this symbolize? What does this symbolize? That's a very quick way of driving yourself crazy.
Yeah. Bruce Edwards once, I think he was quoted back when the Narnia movies came out. Bruce Edwards, lovely Lewis scholar of blessed memory. He said, read the lines before you try to read between the lines.
Yes. Very good piece of advice, that. So the next question then is, when should you read this in your Lewis reading? So Matt, in your introduction, you spoke about, well, if this is your first Lewis book, would you recommend that to people?
Personally, no. Obviously, I recognize there's different people, a scholar of like Andrew's caliber, even if they weren't a scholar on Lewis and they're coming in, but they're very literature forward type of individual, might love this to be their first book. But I would imagine if you were with the masses, which I think I'm much more closer in that camp, I wouldn't hand this book as the first book, and I'm probably not sure it would have been great if it was handed to me rather than like a Mere Christianity or Screw Tape Letters or the classics. So short answer is I probably would put it later. And now knowing what I know, I do think reading The Four Loves before it and just having even one sentence that this is very connected to The Four Loves is a very helpful thing to give you some semblance of how to unpack it.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other works you think people should have read first?
Screw Tape. Yeah. And that was the key for me. We'll get more into this, but Screw Tape and The Four Loves were what unlocked it for me. I don't know that it would necessarily, well, it's a complex response. When should it come in your Lewis reading? People usually turn to, at least I turn to it once I had exhausted all the regular Lewis that one normally reads. I think if one approaches it with the caveat that it's really working cumulatively and at a real depth that's happening, and that it will require more reading, and that that any Lewis that you have read will help you understand Till We Have Faces better. If I read it like that, I don't think it's wrong to read that even first, knowing, okay, I may not get this. Let me see what it does for me as a story, and then let me think about how I'll come back to it later. So I don't know that it matters that much as long as our expectations of it is not, as you said, David, oh, this is going to be just like what I've already read. If I go in expecting it to be different, but related and connected in some deep way, I don't know that it matters so much. But the more Lewis you read, the better Till We Have Faces will make sense.
I asked our Slackers, and Jake Dean said that he thought folks should have read Narnia and Surprised by Joy. Annie Nardoni, she said, we read this in my Western Civ class, which is mostly 10th to 11th grade students. After 3 years, I have yet to have a student who didn't fall in love with it. Most haven't read Lewis. However, we read the Greek myth prior to this to set the tone. We do a deep dive into the text over 3 weeks.
Annie's students fall in love with it because she's listened to me.
Well, we'll talk about the myth specifically in a moment.
Can I quickly say something on the Annie Nardone thing? I think she's just revealed what I was about to say. Andrew, you triggered something into me that was like, as long as you don't let this turn you away from Lewis, if you for some reason don't like it, I actually think there is a strong argument to be the first thing, because it is all of your experience of Lewis that almost like disappoints you if you're like me, because it was so different and it was so foreign. Where if you come to this like these people, just ready to read it, no preconceived notion of Lewis, and I actually like the idea of reading the Greek myth first, and you're just experiencing it for a Greek myth with no preconceived notions. I could see how that would actually be a good way to do this.
Yeah, and I think that I hadn't thought about it in these terms, so I'm really grateful we're doing this. Expectations have a load to deal with that. And so if you approach it without any kind of guidance, although there's something to be said, because I've met a ton of people who have been like, no idea what it was about, but it really grabbed me and moved me, even though I don't understand it. And so that's the complexity of the book, that it will captivate and compel you, even if you read it with no understanding. And so it's a wild beast. It's not a tame lion.
I'm going to be the dissenting voice. I would strongly urge someone not to read it first. If for no other reason, I think it's very difficult to read a work with no preconceptions. And also, there are an awful lot of minds scattered around in this work that I think could turn people off quite considerably. And I want to make sure that they get the Lewis bug. And I think this could deter somebody. And so, in addition to The Four Loves, which I think is a very good book to have read first, I'm going to make the argument for The Great Divorce.
Absolutely.
And I say this because The Great Divorce, I think, expresses many of the themes that are explored in Till We Have Faces. But I argue, and for me, this is an important point, I think the themes are much clearer. And so when you can see something in with clarity, when it is then more masked, and very often purposefully masked later, you're more likely to pick up on it.
And actually, as I began to kind of unlock and find all the revelation about it, that literally was my hierarchy. I was asked to teach a class for the C.S. Lewis Foundation at Williams College in 2006 in the summer. And they said, pick any 2 books. And I said, The Four Loves and Till We Have Faces. And as I'm flying to Massachusetts, Screwtape and The Great Divorce are the kind of second-tier primary sources. And so Four Loves, Screwtape, Great Divorce, if you can only read 3, or if you have read those 3, they'll serve as a kind of primer. I'm going to pronounce it in primer.
That's fine. It's only 1 M, but carry on.
Yes. So yeah, Great Divorce is certainly, that was key to helping me understand it. So I fully agree.
And I didn't want to just stick in the main works, because there's actually a ton of essays, which I think would also prepare you very well to read this book. Now, people don't typically do it in this order, but I do just want to point out some of them. So first of all, God in the Dock, the essay as well as the book, principally because the dock it's where the defendant stands in a British court.
Yeah, you mean the essay, not the whole collection of essays?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
On forgiveness, because we have issues in this text. The trouble with X, because it refers to how we regard other people and how we think about ourselves. I was chatting with Jordan Duncan from the Less Known Lewis podcast, and he suggested miserable offenders. I'd also add lilies that fester, which is the entire notion of good things turning bad. Myth became fact, the relationship between stories and reality, and as well as petitionary prayer, a problem without an answer, because Orual prays quite a few times in this book, and it's worth knowing what Lewis thinks about these things. The seeing eye, because it's about perception, the language of religion. If you read the language of religion, it's basically the argument that the fox and the priest have before the king, as well as Christian apologetics. And for me, this was a particularly important one, because it explains how Lewis thought about and categorized religions. I just want to read a short little section from it. He says, "We may reverently divide religions as we do soups into thick and clear. By thick, I mean those which have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments. Africa is full of thick religions. By clear, I mean those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing, such as Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church are clear religions. Now, if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear, for the true God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly." And once I'd read that essay, a lot of Orual's own struggles and the conflict that she has with the fox and the priest started to make a little bit more sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have just made one of my points. And when I say that Till We Have Faces is cumulative, I will make the claim, and I'm fond of overstating my claims, jumping in the deep end and then seeing if I can swim my way out. But this is actually true of my experience in the last 19 years, and I'm not trying to use 19 years of study as a club to try to win an argument. What I have found is everything I have read by Lewis shows up in some way in Till We Have Faces, even the things that he wrote after Till We Have Faces. Mm-hmm. And so it's, and occasionally I'll pick up an essay or a book and go, surely not this. And before I'm a few pages or paragraphs in, there are echoes for what he's doing until We Have Faces. That's not me trying to be a homer or exaggerating. It is cumulative. And Owen Barfield, this is, I think, an important key. Mm-hmm. Owen Barfield said what C.S. Lewis thought about everything is secretly present in what he said about anything. And never is that more true than Until We Have Faces. I can see all of the themes and everything that Lewis is doing in that book. And so I love your list. I would also add experiment and criticism. I must see with other eyes. My own eyes are not enough for me. Mere Christianity, out of ourselves, into Christ we must go. I mean, but the list would go on.
Andrew, you're doing our talk at the festival, because this is what we're going to be doing. It's what do they teach in these schools? Till We Have Faces. It's all Until We Have Faces.
It's all Until We Have Faces. Yes. So maybe we could just play this broadcast and we'll have done with it. No, I'm kidding. You're talking about the Petoskey Festival in September.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Before we talk about the myth, just in general terms, Matt, let's start with you. What do you think people should pay attention to in the book, and what should they not worry about?
What do we do this, maybe? What if...
No, answer my question.
Well, I'm getting concerned, like, that we're already kind of halfway through, and I want to make sure we protect time. This is helpful, but I really want to get into a little bit of some of the core stuff, too. And so maybe Andrew and you guys just kind of give these more bullet points, because honestly, I'm not going to be the person that offers much value to these two questions.
The highest doesn't stand without the lowest, Matthew.
And you thought I was being harsh towards Matt.
What should we pay attention to? Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would say if I had to put it in a nutshell, I would pay what I'm probably going to do the next time I read this in about 10 years is going to be making sure I'm paying attention to the self-deception of love and probably the things that prevent Orual from seeing the truth. And then I'm trying to understand, this is probably my number one critique. Even knowing now the way that the loves are very distorted with her, and you can see that, and Andrew's really helped me see that. I've never once been able to even relate to the character. I'm always shocked when people tell me I've related so much. I'm like, it's like the most unrelatable thing. It seems so extreme. It seems so out there. And so I think, to the extent that people are able to kind of put themselves into that, see the self-deception in their life, the way the possessive loves, the different types of possessive loves, the healing journey of possessive love towards, and assume that's kind of the stuff to pay attention to.
I would say in some ways, and I say this deliberately and I won't go into it, in some ways, Till We Have Faces is a mirror. The first word of the book is I. And so we have to speak through Orual's mouth. And so we are literally enunciating her experience as our experience. And so what I would pay attention to is what you think and what you feel as you're reading it. Where do you agree with her? I would pay attention to your own reaction to the book. If it's difficult and it's off-putting, and Lewis clearly says, don't read more than a page and a half of a book you don't enjoy. But if it's difficult, ask yourself why. And so pay attention to your own reaction to Orual and to what's going on in the book. That's what I'd pay attention to, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I would say pay attention to what we're told and then what we actually observe. Because there are many statements in the text, and you read them, it's like, is that actually true, though? Based on the things that we know, is that actually true? I would say that's for me is number one. Number two is also just keep love on your radar. Andrew, when you and I first spoke, when we were about to start Till We Have Faces, you pointed me to Orual's first line when she says that she's alone, she doesn't have friends.
I have no husband, no father, no child, no husband, no child, nor hardly even a friend through whom the gods can hurt me.
Exactly. Pay attention to whenever love is talked about or expressed, because I would suggest it's going to be important. And as for things you shouldn't worry about, when I asked Slack, JK said, ignore nothing. Pay attention to everything. There's not a comma out of place. It's Chekhov's gun everywhere the whole way through, which I would say is good advice.
It's true.
Yeah,
it's true.
But I would also say what I said a little earlier, don't be constantly haunted by what is Lewis trying to say? That can come later. Just start with, what is Orual trying to say?
And that's kind of what I meant, dive in when Lewis says, I would gladly read a book written by a dog. So his reading experience is to give the author access to his own mind and to go, okay, what is the author trying to do? What is the character trying to do? Let me see if I can forget myself and enter into this world. And self-forgetfulness, I'll say, is one of the first stages of love, right? Looking through somebody else's point of view. And so, yeah, just go along for the ride, trusting that there's really, really interesting, important stuff there. So if you don't get it, good. Notice why you don't get it or what you don't like. What bugs you about it is also very descriptive. And once you understand it, what bugs you about that book, I think will be very interesting way to explore some really crucial issues.
Now, the final sort of technical issue is, when should you read the myth itself? So we already heard about Annie Nardoni, her experience of it. JK also had some thoughts on this, saying, some people say it's helpful to have read The Myth of Cupid and Psyche before reading Till We Have Faces. I disagree for two reasons. One, C.S. Lewis included it himself in the afterwards, not the preface. And so I think he wants you to read it afterwards. Number two, the story is so different, I personally believe, if anything, having the myth beforehand might distract you from this story. This story stands on its own, even if there never was a Cupid and Psyche myth, and perhaps how this story differs from the original myth is the most important part. Now, I agree with some of those criticisms, and my personal suggestion is always to read it between part one and part two, so that you come to the Lewis's story blind, basically. So if you don't know the myth, great. So just encounter Lewis's story. But I would suggest, I think, we're going to really try and avoid spoilers in this discussion, but for the stuff that happens in part two, which is a pretty short part of the book, I found it helpful to have actually read the myth at that point.
So I'm going to, in a friendly way, disagree with both of you. And JK has been spot on so far, in my opinion. But I think that you have to read the afterword first, because the subtitle of Till We Have Faces is A Myth Retold. And you don't have the context for what the myth is that's being retold if you don't read the summary. In the note, it's a really quick summary. And then Lewis talks about the central alteration to the myth that he first read in Apuleius, and talks about his method. And so I think it's very helpful to know that myth. Also, I don't mind spoilers because the nature of classical literature, which is what Lewis is trying to do, is you come in media res. You come already knowing the outcome. People who go to the theater in the golden age of Athens know for sure what happens to Oedipus.
This is ending badly.
This is going to end badly. And so to see what Lewis is about, and that note actually didn't appear in the first edition, the British first edition, and then he added it to the American first edition. So I think that it's worth reading the note just to kind of get your sea legs and to at least understand the kind of mysterious thing that Lewis says in the title, Till We Have Faces, a Myth Retold. So whenever you want, I guess, is the answer based on, yeah.
The thing that I've been still trying to ask myself, there's been a couple different kind of questions. I even asked Gemini this to kind of help me understand this a little bit. Andrew, if you had to phrase, you talked about the first time, the second time, the third time, it finally started clicking. I've read a lot. The way I'd phrase this, what is the key? Whether it's some of the key scenes earlier on, obviously we don't want to give away the story, or the key themes or the key ideas that like unlock this book, where the aha kind of moment happens, where it becomes clear what is being communicated.
That's a great question. And if I'm having a conversation with somebody and I'm trying to summarize it in just, a couple of minutes, one of the things that is absolutely key is to understand that it really is the four loves. I am old now and have not much to fear from the anger of gods. I have no husband, that's Eros, no child, that's Storge, nor hardly even a friend, that's Philia, through whom the gods, and by the gods she means Eros and Aphrodite, Cupid and Venus, the gods of love. And so that's the opposite of agape. So it's about her grappling with this idea of love. And so that theme, as David pointed out, I think is worth paying attention to. Another thing that I would really pay careful attention to is on the first page of book 2, she said, I should unroll my scroll and start from the beginning, but there's no time. But to leave it as it is would be to die perjured. And there's deliberate lying. There's deliberate falsehood that Orual writes in the pages of the book. She is, it goes even far beyond untrustworthy narrator. She is deliberately trying to mislead the reader, and she's also deliberately misleading herself. And so what happens in between book 1 and book 2 is she begins to try to tell the truth.
Can we press into those two? Those are really helpful. Can we press into those two? Because this is helpful. So that first one, I really love the way you phrased that. So effectively, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's the four loves. She's got a possessive love for them all because she's...
And let me add a third thing really quickly because they cluster together. If you look at the first 2 words of the book and the last 2 words of book 1, and she calls attention to the last 2 words of book 1 several times in book 2. I ended my last book with the words no answer. Book 1, you can summarize in its first 2 and last 2 words, I am no answer. And then in book 2, she says, I know now, Lord, why you give no answer. You yourself are the answer, right? And so what you have in book 1 is her realizing that she isn't the answer. It's the first of the spiritual laws. I'm a sinner. I can't do it all my own. It's the first of the 12 steps in recovery. And then by the end of the book, she says to the God of love, you are the answer. You yourself are the answer. And as I've said in other episodes, to go out of ourselves towards the other, that's love. And so to understand, I am no answer out of myself. You are the answer towards the other. She's learning how to love in the course of the book. And so that's another kind of quick key that will help to understand what the whole project, some of what the whole project is. Sorry, please go ahead. Forgive me.
No, this is helpful. I mean, we got to keep this straight in my head. All right, let's start with the first one. So what's that quote? To love is to become a demon, to make a love a God that becomes a demon.
Love ceases to be a demon when it ceases to be a God. Or
okay, there we go.
When the real God comes, the half-gods can take their proper place.
So she effectively, which I want to kind of circle back to why she has such a hatred towards the God, but she doesn't have divine love properly oriented in her life. In fact, a hatred towards it. And so these earthly loves have become gods to her. It's possessive. And by the end of this book is showing going down that entire path, you will lose all of it. Is that what he's kind of showing? Like, if you make a god out of affection, which she did, you make a god out of Eros, you make a god out of Storge.
I think it's even simpler. I think that she has become an idol to herself.
She's become an idol to herself.
She is more important than God. And we are all idolaters when we sin. When I prefer myself to what God has done, right? I have put as more important in directing my life, my own wants and needs, as opposed to what God wants for me. Idolatry is at the heart of our struggle with God.
But then can you connect that statement back to, because that almost seems like a different theme. I mean, they're connected, but connect that back to then what you made in the beginning, the Eros Historia effect.
Sure. What are the first two words of the book? I am. Orual begins by claiming the divine name of God.
Yep.
She's all concerned with her. And Lewis says, out of ourselves into Christ we must go, or our real selves are waiting for us in him. And so we have to get over ourselves and bow the knee, as David pointed out years ago, which has been so helpful, in order to say, you are higher than me. And in Lewis's own autobiography, he was very reluctant to pray because his last religion is solipsism. He only believed in his own self. And he says, finally, I gave in, I knelt, I prayed, and I admitted that God was God, and what I greatly feared at last came upon me. And he gave up himself in order to receive the God of love. Orual, in all of book 1, will not give up herself, and the self is the worst of the false idols, of the false gods.
Bringing it back to the four loves, though. So
yeah.
At first, my thinking has been this is all primarily about the four loves, but it almost sounds like this, what you just said here, almost is like the superseding theme, and then the four loves are secondary below it?
No. It's love is out of myself towards the other. Mm-hmm. That's the definition of love. How does that express itself in Eros? Well, out of myself and towards my lover I go. How does it express myself in Philia? Out of myself towards my friend, out of myself towards my family member, out of myself, my own image of God, and towards who God reveals himself to be. And so the fundamental move of love, and then you say, okay, how does that express itself in the four loves? Love is fundamentally self-abandonment and approaching the other.
If we think of this almost like as an org chart, sounds terrible to say, but the very first primary thing is that like the relationship with God. And by being I am first, it's an idolatrous self-love over the love of the divine. Then if you almost think of like the offshoots of the four loves below it, or actually maybe this case would be the three loves.
Right.
The offshoots of those become toxic, negative, possessive, because that first orientation is wrong.
And Lewis says, we talk about our love for God, but I think God's love for us is a far safer theme.
Mm-hmm.
And remember that, and my bishop pointed this out to me when I was talking to him about my theology of ministry. It's not about our love for God. That's the summary of the law. The summary of the law is to love God and to love neighbors. That's the Old Testament. The more important thing is God's love for us. And what you have is Orual thinking about how she has been unloved, and she doesn't pay attention to the fact that the gods of love have actually been loving and kind toward her all throughout the book. And only at the very end does she almost realize how much the gods have loved her. And so it's a fundamental shift. And that's why I'm glad, David, you pointed out all those essays about the changing of perspective. It's not about what I do for God. I can do nothing. It's about what God does for me, right? And so that's the kind of not my efforts, but his love towards me. And that's what the whole of Christianity is about. Not keeping the law, but accepting the forgiveness of the lawgiver when he lets me off the hook because I can't keep the law because I'm sinful. It's God's love coming down and expressed in the incarnation and the death on the cross and the resurrection and the ascension.
So, all right, that's a really good transition then, because that gives me enough there. So I have a framework of this part. So the next part I really think would be super helpful to press into is the why it's distorted. We know it is distorted in the beginning. We know it's impacting the loves. We know that's a huge theme throughout it. And then we know that obviously switches in the end. So is it in the beginning, is it distorted because she was treated poorly? Like there's a justification, like she's super self-inwardly towards because she is ugly. She has been wounded by because I think understanding this is the next key thing. I have sort of understood, this was actually more clear what you just said earlier, but I have sort of had a bit of a grasp of that. Then the next part is like putting myself into this story and like, how can we kind of connect this to our own spiritual journeys of our own ugliness and the ways that our own self-possessive love, like in her case, what is it in the beginning that like makes her so turn off to the gods, makes her, and is it justified? Kind of talk a little bit, not too long, but.
Sure. And it's a great question. I'll circle back to what Lewis says in his letters. In volume 3, he talks about his Cambridge experiment, which he also calls a flop initially. And he says, my lectures have never been more poorly attended. And then he says, it's probably rather frightfully good for me. So look, we have all had experiences that we thought were God letting us down. And then we realized it wasn't God letting us down. It was God providing a better good than we could have imagined for ourselves. Sometimes the no is so full of grace. And so Orual is receiving all of this negative stuff. She had huge trauma, an abusive father, a dead mother, 2 dead mothers, right? She did not have it good. But her response to that was selfish. And it's kind of like Corrie ten Boom, whose sister, they're in the concentration camp. And they're naked and being probed and judged by these Nazi guards. And Corrie ten Boom said, well, what about this? How can this be any good? And her sister said, well, Corrie, he was naked too. And so to take suffering as a gift, and the New Testament says that God has not only allowed you to believe in him, but also has graciously granted for us to suffer for him. And to receive suffering as whatever correction from God that I may not understand at the moment. And we can all look back at our own lives and go, oh, here's this thing that I thought was terrible. And what in fact was happening was God was saving me from something or teaching me something that I later on needed. Orual can't get over herself. And so all of her very legitimate traumas and troubles, she takes as evidence that God hates her. But if we do that, that's a fatal word, because he who began a good work in us will bring it to completion. God allows us to go through difficult things because he loves us and can correct and form and shape us in no other way. Lewis says, God would not allow us to wait unless he saw some good in the waiting. And I've been clinging to that as I wait to find out what my next job is and trying to say, oh, this thing that I would like to change, I need to just say, yes, Lord, that must be what's the best for me, even though I don't understand it. But we've all been through those experiences where we went through something that we would not have chosen. And even the hard thing becomes better than the good I would have chosen for myself. And that's part of changing, lifting my eyes to heaven and looking from his perspective rather than my own. Orual doesn't get to that point until the very end. And so she's struggling, as we all struggle, with, I don't like what happened to me. And yes, she was abused. She was absolutely ill-treated. But her reaction to it was to hate God and to justify herself. And it turned her hard-hearted. And she's like the grumbler who becomes a grumble. She's like all of those characters in The Great Divorce, which is why that is such a helpful book to read before reading this one, because they are so consumed with themselves and the unjust things that happened to them. And they don't see that God could have been using those things in order to make them who he wanted them to be.
So, all right. And maybe I should preface this a little bit for listeners. This is super helpful. A few other questions could start to get into spoilers as I unpack a few things here. So I think right now, if people are like, haven't read this, I think you just got a lot that will give you plenty to move forward, would be my gut. Because
that's why you should read it first. No, I'm kidding.
Yes. So then help me understand. So we have, clearly I understand the full arc of it, what's being communicated, and then her hardness of heart, and then that journey. what are a couple of the key scenes in it as it plays out? This is why I told listeners, maybe if you haven't read it, stop now. That show the changing of the heart. Like, what is, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, when does God start to intervene? How is it playing out?
Yeah. So Lewis in his poems has got the 5 sonnets, and one of the sonnets talks about a moth booming against the window pane for hours, thinking that the way to reach the flowers. The gods are trying to love her all the way along, right?
And what are some examples of that real quick, actually?
For example, they made her ugly, but if she had been beautiful, she would have been married off and she never would have been queen. And in becoming queen, she found out who she really was, and she made great improvements. And she has this wonderful reputation, as Arnam says at the very end of the book. I had a conversation with Diana Glyer and Jim Como from the New York C.S. Lewis Society and lots of other works. And I, in my typical understated fashion, said to Jim, yeah, I know more about TWHF than anybody in the world. And he said, oh, really? Well, what's the most important thing that gets said? And I said, well, on page 93, I think, or 96 or something. As she's trudging up the mountain to go bury Psyche, who has been offered to the gods, as she's going up the mountain on a sad task with her heart full of despair, she hears a voice, not a voice, but if it had been a voice, it would have said, why should your heart not dance? So there's this invitation as she's going up the mountain of the God of love, who is the son of the God of love. She's going up the mountain and she's full of despair. And her heart gets a vocal invitation to dance, to joy. And she said, it's a measure of my folly that I almost said, why not? And I had to tell myself over like a lesson all the reasons my heart had to dance. And then she lists all the reasons that her heart has to dance, and none of them ever came true. So she's making up false futures that never happened. What she never does is say, I'm sorry, who's speaking? It's not her subconscious that's inviting her to joy. That's not in her. It's the God of love who says, why should your heart not dance? And just a few pages later, Psyche, the bride of the God of love, says, Psyche, or Orual, why should our hearts not dance? And she never picks up on the fact that that's been asked of her before. So she refuses this invitation out of herself and into joy. And that's what blinds her. That's what allows her not to see when she gets into the valley, Psyche dressed in finery and in a beautiful palace. And we know from what I've said before about Lucy and all the rest that vision is granted because of love. Love is when I go out of myself and I try to see with other eyes. She refuses this invitation to joy and then gets down to the valley and cannot see because she has blinded herself by her selfishness. And then, as David pointed out years ago, and it is fundamental to the understanding not only of Till We Have Faces, but to all of Lewis's work and what he was about. And I'm grateful to David, will always be grateful to him. When she gets on her knees, driven by thirst, which is a key theme in Lewis, like, in Silver Chair, there is no other stream. When she gets on her knees and assumes the posture of humility, of going out of herself, and drinks the water, she looks up and she can see the palace.
And one other thing. In order to drink, she has to remove her veil. She has to remove her mask. She has to show herself, her true face to the God.
Yes. She has to unveil. She has to be naked before him.
So humility and vulnerability, or humility and true self coming together.
And humility is, I think, the opposite not only of pride, but it's the synonym with love. Not me, but you. It's one of the 2-part stages of love. Out of myself, humility, towards the other, right? So it's the negating of the self and the favoring of the other is the 2-part move of love. And just by physically assuming the posture of humility, God, the God of love, gives her vision just because her body is in a humble position, even though her heart and her mind are not. And Lewis, in Letters to Malcolm, which is written after Till We Have Faces, in Letters to Malcolm, he says the body needs to pray too. When Orual's body takes on the position of humility, of confession, of repentance, the God gives her vision and invites her to see the house of love. And she never tells the fox about it, never tells Arnam about it, never tells Bardia. And that's the central lie that taints everything else that she writes. If she had gone to the fox and said, hey, when I got on my knees, I saw the house of love, he would have told her what to do and would have believed, right? If she said to Bardia, I really saw the god's palace, it's not just religion, it's an actual thing, he would have believed, right? Arnam would have said, oh, that makes complete sense of all our cultic religion. That's what that's all about. The house of love lives here in Glome, right? And our princess has become the bride of love. And it would have revolutionized in a really positive way the religion of Glome. It would have made the religion clearer, not as thick, but she lies to everybody and pretends it's not the truth. But that's the central fact. She kneels, God gives her vision, she sees the house of love, and she should have repented at that moment, and she doesn't. In the same way that when God reveals himself to us, we often resist and go our own way, and it ends up in our tragedy.
I think one thing that's helpful about that is or encouraging from Lewis's choice of that is, if assuming you're correct, that's in like page 90. That's in like the first third of the book, right? Something, or first.
Yeah, page 96 or something.
Yeah. So what's kind of cool is like early enough in her journey, she had a chance. Like, because I think sometimes too, it feels almost like it's a blend of, it's hard to relate to a little bit, hard to put myself in her shoes, but then at the same time, it also feels like you almost sympathize for her. You kind of understand where she's coming from.
And that's
God didn't make this very helpful.
And I sympathize with her in all of her complaints against the God. I'm like, yeah, why don't the gods give us more evidence? Why don't they come out and say it clearly?
Yeah.
And that's the trap that first-time readers often fall into. We believe Orual and we have those same kind of angry thoughts about God. But then when we realize that she's lying and deceiving herself, and yes, why should your heart not dance is page 96 on almost every version of it.
And probably more than just the pages. I mean, I guess I don't know, I got caught up in the pages. It's early in her life, more from the years.
Yeah, it's early in her life. And that's another thing to keep in mind. She's writing her whole story at the end of her life after she's seen a sanitized version, and she sees this story getting out about Psyche, and she's going to set the record straight about how horrible the gods were. She sees the gods being worshipped, and she can't stand that. And she goes to accuse the god, and it's a complaint against the gods. But she realizes that it's just her own kind of selfishness, and the god says, are you answered? And she says, the gods probed me with my own pen. By writing her complaint, she realizes that she has no complaint at all, and the gods really loved her. And we're trying to give her revelation and love, trying to get her to get over herself, to get out of herself. And that's what God's always trying to do with us. No to me, yes to you. I've got an icon of St. John right over here, and it's St. John looking over, and his hands are pointed over. He must increase, I must decrease. And that's a truth that Orual only comes to at the very, very, very end.
So a couple of short questions then now, because you could dive into all these things, but this has actually been super helpful. Is it safe to kind of assume that, even though I know these are myth gods, that sort of our idea of who God is for us is kind of like a loving, a beautiful God, a creator God, and we just get this massively distorted thing that's not even remotely accurate from her, but they are really loving? Because I think that's another thing. It's almost hard. Like the God seems so foreign because she muddies the water with who it is, and it's already a myth. And I'm like, is it safe to kind of assume that like Lewis is trying to communicate a loving God, a beautiful God that's crafting or that's not pertinent to the story? Or
so Lewis is this is Doris Myers in Bareface points out that this is probably 300 or 400 BC, and so let's assume that there aren't really other gods, but it is Christ trying to speak to her through the guise of the religion of that area, and so.
Okay.
He's trying to correct our dim understanding of the gods and say, oh, wow, that's you behind all of that. So yeah, I think that there's some of that in it. By the way, her kneeling to see and seeing the palace is page 136 out of 311 or something.
And finally, then maybe switch the gears, because that I think unlocks a ton. I think the other thing I struggled with, so maybe help the listener and me, was relating to her. Like, I think in life, my gut has always been all these same principles, not gut, it's true. All these same principles apply to myself. There's a sense of self-hatred that I have like anyone else, on a spectrum of complete saint-like self-love to, or, rightly ordered self-love to completely disordered self-hatred, which forms into more of a egotistical self-love. And then, of course, there's a journey that happens. And of course, that's making my life worse because I'm turning to some degree on 0 to 100. My normal love is a little bit self-possessive. And obviously, where we all are on the spectrum of this 0 to 100 is going to be a little bit different. Her seems so extreme that it was just hard for me to enter into this story. Ironically, even though the story is probably one of the most pertinent examples of the journey, but it was almost like too extreme. Like, what would you say to someone that's like, here's how you could have seen yourself more in this. You're probably more relating to Orual than you think. Like, I hear 2 trauma parents, or parents died, abusive, completely ugly, all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't really relate to this journey. Could it have been subtler? Could it have been, what are your thoughts like that side of it?
So, and this is one of the things that really helped me to understand the larger project. And that's part of why the 4 Loves is so helpful. On the last page of the 4 Loves, and I'm preaching about this weekend, this is what Lewis says at the end of the 4 Loves. Perhaps for many of us, all experience merely defines, so to speak, the shape of that gap where our love of God ought to be. It is not enough. It is something. If we cannot practice the presence of God, it is something to practice the absence of God, to become increasingly aware of our own unawareness, till we feel like men who should stand beside a great cataract, a great waterfall, and hear no noise, or like a man in a story who looks in a mirror and finds no face there. And so what Lewis is doing in this project is using Orual to describe the shape of that gap where our love of God ought to be, to describe the apparent absence of God. It's a negative space drawing. And Frederick Buechner says, God's never gone. It's just men go blind. When I think that God is not in a difficult situation, it's not because anything has separated me from the love of God. It's because I have listened to lies that have trained my eyes not to see the present hand of the loving God. And that's the battle.
So are you saying if that gap is large, because it's like the Augustine, restless heart, if that gap is large, it's going to be a vacuum sucking from the world at a very hyper, like sucking up, trying to fill it with anything it can and unsuccessfully filling it. And all of those things are going to become collateral damage in the process because none of them are going to be able to fill that vacuum. So if that's the case, it still feels like he chose to communicate this through the biggest vacuum possible.
Yes.
And like for many people, the vacuum's not that big.
Well, the thing is, we enter into it in our own way. And there's a little Orual in all of us. At some point, we go, wait a minute, I don't know that I agree with her all the way. But I'm mindful of what Lewis wrote into Joy Davidman's copy of The Great Divorce. There are 3 images that I must continually remove and replace forsake and replace with better ones. My image of God, my image of my neighbor, and my image of myself. To put a false image in the place of God is to be an idolater. Orual is a particularly heinous and selfish idolater, but we are all idolaters when we see God as we think he is instead of how he reveals himself to be. Anytime I doubt God's goodness, I have substituted a false god of my own making, which is why the Old Testament is full of charges against idolatry, and those charges are very prescient and very helpful now. I tend to think of God as I want him or I think him to be, rather than who he really is, and that's why I need to go back and correct my image again and again, replace my image with who he declares himself to be. So, yeah, so there's a little Orual in all of us. And there's always idolatry anytime I do anything except for live in full faith, of God's loving kindness to me that nothing can separate me from. But I don't live like that every day. I only live like that in moments every day, if that many.
No, I appreciate you. That was super helpful. And I will reread this because I'm now curious with this knowledge. And it's really clear to have that kind of arc.
Before 10 years.
Yeah, I'll probably read it in the next couple years. I do think the key thing there at the end too was the little Orual. I think maybe my final thing, it's not really a question that I still struggle with, and it'd be an interesting thing to ponder, is maybe the final thing to get this from he did something really great here to the best work is, could there have been a better, am I getting really caught up into a lot of people that the medium he chose to do this was what I think is a little bit more of a less relatable medium of the character from like being a Greek mythology to the average person. And that's the part that I get a little bit hung up on, is you just mentioned the little Orual, big Orual, because I do agree. It's like the blend of the medium, and he went big Orual that feels a little bit less relatable. And it kind of made me almost miss the little Orual in myself because I kept focusing on, well, I can't even relate to this big Orual. Or I have a huge blind spot.
Yeah. So what I would do is circle back to, and it's where I often start, Lewis calls it far and away my best book, right? And so he's either exaggerating, he's misjudging his work, he's lying. None of those seem at all true, or it actually is true. And so what I think is happening is not only is Till We Have Faces his best book, because everything he's doing is in there, and there's some space for us in several readings of that book. I think it's his best book because it helps us to shift our whole understanding of Lewis, certainly away from joy. Joy is a pointer to something other and outer, he says in Surprised by Joy. Joy is a pointer towards love. He's helping us to understand that the fundamental human issue in the universe is me or him. Mm-hmm. It's me or God. It's love or selfishness. And anybody who's been in a relationship knows that when our partners or our friends or whatever irritate us, I can harden my heart or soften my heart. There's not a lot of stasis in marriage or friendship or religion or anything else. And God calls us constantly to soften our hearts towards him, to focus on his love instead of our own need. And he must increase and I must decrease. And that fight is a lifelong fight. And there's a way into all of that Till We Have Faces. So I think that he wrote a 20th century masterpiece. I think he wrote something on the level with a Milton. And I think that once we get, once it gets explained, it's kind of like Michael Ward with Narnia, showing how there's so much more depth in it than we thought. I think that elucidating that book will help people see how it is really one of the all-time masterpieces. I think that Lewis was right, but then people don't have the slightest idea. And because I think I do have an idea, and I think if I can help folks with it, the book will rise in their estimation.
If you can get this book written and go on podcast circuit, I think there is a chance to take this to another level. And I would probably say the message he's communicating is truly profound, and it is the ultimate journey. I'm probably still slightly in the camp that if he was consulting me back in 1950s, I would say choose a different medium, because if your goal is to communicate the most profound truths, and that is in the definition of best work or masterpiece, actually, I do think he did that. If you add one extra dimension to this and have tens of millions at it understand it on a first pass, or at least can relate to it or enter into it.
I don't want them to understand it on the first pass. Jesus did not open his mouth without telling a parable, so that seeing they would not see, and hearing they would not hear. And Proverbs says it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, to search out a matter is the glory of kings. And Orual says the writing was the answer. The gods probed me with my own pen. And so I think the fact that he made it so obscure helps us to read ourselves and read God's love into ourselves as we seek to search it out. He, yes, made it very complex. He made it very hidden. But I think that that's the glory of the book. I don't think he should have made it easier.
I think I probably take a different stance there still after you saying it. I think that makes sense for Christianity. Let me give you the perfect example. This is a completely different thing, but TurboTax. TurboTax is a little bit of a pain in the butt, but we all have to do our taxes. So we're going to go through the process of it, and we will do it. And they've tried to make it a little bit easier, but you can't apply that same standard to most consumer apps because they don't have the incentive they have to do this. I think Christianity with scripture, with Christ, with revealing truth, by definition, people are going to wrestle with that, and hundreds of millions will wrestle with it. Most will never wrestle with TWHF faces. Therefore, this masterpiece has been lost to 100,000 people. And I think there is a way it could have been brought into millions personally. And I think it's almost like, if I had to put it, it's almost an excuse when it could have gone a step further, I think personally, and been a little bit more relatable, a little bit more accessible. Well, still, I don't think, even after you unpacked it, that the truth had to have been masked quite this much personally.
I don't know. And that's me as a literary scholar. We're still finding things in Shakespeare that we never had seen. And there are some writers, John Donne, others, who have a renaissance and come into their own years after they have written. And so I think that Lewis's greatness is before him. And I think that understanding this work will finally put Lewis in the position that he needs to be. Yes, it's missed a lot of readers because he hit it very well. But I think that we're just to evaluate the book based on that is chronological snobbery. I think if we look back on TWHF Faces in 100 years, I think it is going to rise in people's estimation, not only Christians, not only Lewis fans, but I think it's going to rise in literary reputation and will be one of the great novels of the 20th century in all of literature, all of English literature. And so I think that your response, I get it, but I think that's because we're at the moment before it comes into its own. But I think that it's going to come into its own, and I'm going to do everything I can to help it do so.
Yeah, I think that'd be maybe the last thing I'd say is if that plays out, and it will require people like you to do this, and we can look back in 50 or 100 years, that would be amazing. Like if we can actually get this to that level where people actually see it. I don't think it's going to naturally happen. I think it's going to take people like you to get this going. It's going to take...
Sure. But that's what happens to literature that's been overlooked in its time. And,
yes,
that's what happens to literature, like the revival of John Donne. He's risen recently in estimation. And so, It's not me because I'm so insightful, although I think I do have some real insight into it. But I think the greatness of the work and the greatness of Lewis's project is there. And when I talk to people and they hear me do my whole talk, and we can put up the link to the Wade Center talk where I, unpacked it, and, there are other things. When people understand it and then go back and reread it, they are completely blown away and have no argument about, oh, I can see why Lewis called it far and away my best. You don't have to think it far and away his best, but I think it's a justifiable claim for Lewis to have made.
Yeah. And maybe here's the key thing. I'd be curious as we won't go down this path now. Maybe I'll leave this with the listeners. Now that you've heard Andrew and I have to unpack the beautiful messages of the spiritual journey, the core truths of what's really necessary, the key question in my mind, could this have been written differently while communicating all of those? Or is this the only way that this could be written? Like, is there a way that all of this truth where there is like a person angry at God?
Aslan says, I never tell anyone else's story. And could it have been different? There are a couple of keys that I didn't touch on. This is where Lewis fell in love with Joy Davidman and she co-wrote it with him. This is also a gospel story. And it's also one of the last in a lifelong arc of writing autobiography. And so there are a lot of other elements. Could he have done it differently? I don't know, but this is what he did. And I actually think, although he's not perfect, I actually think it elevates my estimation of Lewis. And so I hear you. It's difficult, but let's give it 10 years and see what happens. And I think every single line works once you understand it. And I have been fascinated. And the reason I'm so obsessed with it is because it's better and better and better at every reading, and it means more, and it never fails. I never see problems or difficulties with it. I only see more richness that Lewis was hiding there, kind of like we keep finding more richness in a Milton or a Shakespeare. And I think that Lewis had those powers, and I think that those are the conversations, those are the comparisons we should make with it. So,
well, let me take a step back, Andrew, and say thank you for
thanks for your questions.
Giving your wisdom.
Great
We take for granted that we have a scholar like you on here, and I don't want to take for granted that you just let me pick your brain for 45 minutes on a topic you've spent 20 years. So I hope listeners, you guys found this super helpful and gained some insights. Andrew, thank you for your patience with answering these questions. And yeah, I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you. And I would just implore you all to continue to pray for me as I write this book by fits and starts. And Diana Gleyer's been helping me with that. And so what I really want to do as a priest, as a Christian, as a scholar, I want to reveal the love of God in a way that's meaningful and helpful. And that's part of what, that's the center of what I'm trying to do with TWHF Faces. So if you're a person who prays, I would covet those prayers.
You totally have convinced me that there is a potential that this book continues to mature over the next 100 years. And for encouragement for you to finish this cross-finish line.
Sure.
I don't think this happens without you, actually. You might be called to this time and this place. Your wife might have been called to write 90 books. You might have been called to write one and do this one and make a transformational impact in this. Because I do think there is a huge potential for this to reach many, 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 many more people with an understanding of it.
I have, in my prayers, I had this revelation or realization a couple of years ago that my mission, my apostolate, is to write this book and clarify what's going on, because Lewis is helping us see the love of God, which is the most important thing in the universe. And so, at least humanly speaking. And so, yeah, I agree. And I really appreciate it.
I hear the call for the final drink. So thank you to our intern, Julia, our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, all our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Dan, Jody, Robert, Mark, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Megan, Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, K, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud, Aldo, Kevin, Mark, and of course to all of our listeners and all of us co-hosts pray for you guys every single time we release an episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, try picking up Till We Have Faces, either for the first time or the umpteenth time in Journey with Orual.
And please join us next time
when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.